Chapter 1. This Proclamation. London, England, April 1812. Marry your cousin Anne. His father's dying wish was etched in Fitzwilliam Darcy's memory. Not a day went by that he did not think of his excellent father and the exemplary life the gentleman had lived. How I miss him! Sitting tall and upright, Darcy's pensive gaze lingered all about the richly appointed study. He often imagined his late father, as well as his father's father, doing the same. Indeed, he was the product of a long line of Darcy men, proud men whose solemnity of character was evidenced in every aspect of their lives. His great-grandfather's likeness hanging on the wall, in fact, all that he observed throughout the room, served as a stark reminder of the gentleman who he was always meant to be, the best landlord and the best master, a devoted brother and the most steadfast of friends, and one day a faithful husband and caring father. One day. Even while in London during the height of the season, Darcy could not escape the gravity of his situation in life, that being the preservation and, most importantly, augmentation of his family's legacy for the next generation upon generations to come. Having sat in the same attitude for some time, Darcy rose from his rich burgundy leather armchair to stretch his long legs. Moments later, he wandered across the room to command a closer look at the imposing portrait of his ancestor. At length, he rubbed his hand against his chin. Each ensuing generation saw a further tapering of the branches of the Darcy family tree. While the death of his beloved mother, Lady Anne Darcy, had been the catalyst in Darcy's growing up much too soon, it was the loss of his excellent father that had proved to be the most heart-wrenchingly painful. The senior Mr. Darcy had died nearly 4 years prior, leaving Darcy with not only all the responsibility that being the master of Pemberley, one of the grandest estates in Derbyshire, entailed, but also the guardianship of a sister nearly a decade his junior, Miss Georgiana Darcy, a favourite niece of the Earl of Matlock, Lord Edward Fitzwilliam. No doubt as a means of keeping the elder members of the aristocratic Fitzwilliam family at bay, the senior Mr. Darcy also thought to appoint someone as young Miss Darcy's co-guardian, Colonel Richard Fitzwilliam, the Earl's second son. Not that young Darcy had objected. Even with the Colonel's help, Darcy felt he had failed his sister miserably, a mistake he would no doubt remember for the rest of his life, and one he surely would never make again. At present, his sister was residing at Matlock House, under the supervision of his Aunt Lady Ellen Fitzwilliam, the Earl's wife. Indeed, one of the daunting tasks which occupied his busy mind was hiring a suitable companion for Georgiana in preparation for their eventual return to Pemberley. What a comfort it was knowing that, in the interim, his sister was safe and surrounded by family who cared for her, thus allowing Darcy the much-needed time to vet his next hire more thoroughly. The sound of the clock striking 4 aroused Darcy from his wool-gathering. I was supposed to meet the Colonel at White's hours ago. As this was not the first time he had uttered those particular words out loud, Darcy returned to his desk and resumed reading where he had left off before he allowed his mind to drift off. No doubt Richard will understand the call of duty must not go unanswered, at least not so far as I am concerned. Being one of the wealthiest gentlemen in Derbyshire is something indeed, but there is always room for more. A quarter hour later, Darcy's cousin and closest friend strolled into the room. "I thought I might find you tucked away in your study, poring over tedious ledgers. I do not know how you do it. I, for one, can hardly imagine a more dreadful means of passing the time away." "It is a pleasure to see you too, Richard," said Darcy, without tearing his eyes away from the task at hand. "Except that you have not bothered to look up even once since I entered the room." A tall, amiable gentleman, who fell readily into conversation with everyone whom he met, the Colonel was as different from his cousin in that regard as night from day. Whereas Darcy would willingly confess that he found it awkward at best, trying to catch the thread of conversation with people with whom he had nothing in common, the Colonel would surely counter, saying his cousin would simply never give himself the trouble of even trying. Whatever the reason, the end result suited Darcy perfectly fine. Time spent not pursuing his ambitions of increased wealth and power was time wasted so far as Darcy was concerned. It was not that he did not occasionally enjoy the company of close family and friends, but thoughts of more consequential matters that needed attending were never far from his mind. Colonel Fitzwilliam threw himself down into the large leather chair in front of Darcy's desk. Leaning forward, he reached for an opened ledger, casually perused a line or two, and just as quickly slammed the book closed. Tossing the ledger aside, he said, "I do not know how you do it. I, for one, would find such endeavours exceedingly tiresome. This is certainly no way for a fellow to be spending such a fine day as this." "Here." Darcy looked up, and seeing the ledger out of place, he retrieved it and placed it where it ought to be. "It is fortunate, then, that such matters fall to my lot instead of yours." As his cousin was the second son of the Earl of Matlock, Darcy knew he would get no argument from the other man on that score. He knew his cousin to be a good man, indeed, one of the best men of his acquaintance, but in matters of finance and business the Colonel could scarcely be bothered. The older man shrugged. "I should only imagine what a dreary old fellow you shall be once the favourite wish of all our Fitzwilliam relations unfolds." "Why do you suppose that?" Darcy asked. "When I consider the amount of time you spend managing your current business affairs, I cannot help but think it will double once Rosings Park and all the vast holdings that estate entails," here the Colonel cleared his throat, "falls to your lot." The Colonel had spoken nothing but the truth. Rosings Park was renowned as the finest estate in Kent, which was really saying something, and Darcy stood to own it all if and when he chose to embark upon the path to which his cousin had alluded. The favourite wish of all our Fitzwilliam relations, indeed. Darcy had heard the story of how his late mother and his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, had planned the union between his cousin Anne and him for so long as he could remember. From their cradles, it had been decided that the two of them were meant for each other. As her daughter, Anne, was Lady Catherine's only child and thus the heiress of extensive properties, including Rosings Park, it was considered vitally important that Darcy never forgot what was expected of him. To add to the gravity of this proclamation was not only Darcy's late mother's reaffirmation, but his dear father's dying entreaty as well. "My son, you are meant for greatness. Marry your cousin Anne and assume your rightful place among society's elite, the hallowed echelon of lords and dukes." A man would have to be a fool to forgo such an advantageous prospect as the combining of the two great estates entails, Darcy declared. The Colonel leaned back in his seat. Crossing one long leg over the other, he said, "It sounds as though you have finally made up your mind. Shall I be the first to wish you joy?" "Not so hastily, if you please. I have not said I will marry Anne." Indeed, he had not said as much explicitly. Owing to the peculiar nature of the arrangement, he had no reason to do so. Undoubtedly, Lady Catherine will begin ordering wedding clothes for her daughter the instant I speak the words aloud. "And yet you have not exactly said you will not," the Colonel responded. Darcy scoffed. "I say only this. I like to suppose I'm nobody's fool." Chapter 2. Tacit Agreement. When she woke that morning, Miss Elizabeth Bennet never imagined she would have tea with Lady Ellen Fitzwilliam, the Countess of Matlock, and her young niece, Miss Georgiana Darcy. Yet, there Elizabeth sat amid the richly decorated surroundings which spoke of generations of wealth, in particular awe of all she observed. The second eldest of 5 daughters, Elizabeth was enjoying a much-needed holiday in London with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. The opportunity to be away from her immediate family could not have come soon enough. Late last autumn, Elizabeth had committed the ultimate sin, as far as her mother, Mrs. Fanny Bennet, was concerned. She had refused the hand of a so-called respectable, albeit utterly ridiculous man, Mr. William Collins. Adding insult to her mother's injury, the gentleman stood to inherit Longbourn, the Bennets' home. Such an alliance would have secured her family's future in case of her father's death. "Mr. Collins shall toss us all into the hedgerows the minute Mr. Bennet dies, and it will be all your fault, you headstrong, obstinate girl," was now Elizabeth's mother's favourite complaint. A woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper, who fancied herself nervous when she was discontented, Mrs. Bennet vowed never to speak to Elizabeth again, as a result. Amid the former's constant complaints ever since that fateful day, Elizabeth almost wished her mother had kept her promise. What a delightful reprieve from all the mayhem in Hertfordshire. Elizabeth raised her delicate gold-rimmed porcelain cup to her lips. She breathed in the hot tea's sweet floral aroma. The steam tickled her nose as she took a sip. How soothing! The last thing I should dwell upon at such a time as this is the goings-on at Longbourn. London is so diverting. As for her being at the Countess's palatial Grosvenor Square home having tea that day, Elizabeth owed it to her aunt, Mrs. Madeline Gardiner. While her dearest uncle, Mr. Edward Gardiner, lived in Cheapside near his warehouses, He and his wife had escaped the censure inherent in their situation in life. An elegant lady of sense and education, Mrs. Gardiner could readily boast of having friends and acquaintances beyond her sphere. As a courtesy to her aunt, Elizabeth had agreed to spend time in company with Mrs. Gardiner's dear friend, Mrs. Alice Hamilton, whose husband had passed several years prior. A very wealthy woman in her own right, Mrs. Hamilton rounded out Lady Matlock's soirée that afternoon. Having followed the thread of the conversation between Lady Matlock and Mrs. Hamilton most attentively, Elizabeth grew more and more aware that her ladyship's niece seldom spoke anything beyond a monosyllable. Sensibly adorned in a cream-coloured muslin gown with a light blue ribbon sash, young Miss Darcy reminded Elizabeth of her dearest sister Jane, the eldest of the Bennet daughters. Both ladies had angelic countenances, fair complexions, and long blonde locks. Mrs. Hamilton had informed Elizabeth while on the way to Matlock House that young Miss Darcy was but 16. Hence, Elizabeth was quite surprised upon being introduced to one whose fully formed womanly features belied her youth. Elizabeth had first perceived the young lady's reserve as haughtiness. She was, after all, the niece of an earl, his favourite by Mrs. Hamilton's account. Close observation persuaded Elizabeth that the young lady was merely shy. She soon took it upon herself to draw the young lady out. "Do you play, Miss Darcy?" After glancing at her ladyship as though awaiting her cue and not catching her aunt's eye, Miss Darcy nodded. "I do." The rather curt reply aside, Elizabeth persisted. "I suppose you play remarkably well. Do you enjoy exhibiting?" "It depends," the young lady replied. By now the Countess's attention was drawn. A regal woman who had kept more than her fair share of youthful beauty, her ladyship exclaimed, "My niece is quite modest, Miss Bennet. Let me assure you that her mastery of the pianoforte is exemplary." The young woman silently demurred in the wake of such high praise. As if finding her voice, she asked, "Do you play, Miss Bennet?" "A little," Elizabeth began, "although I fear my own mastery of the instrument is severely wanting. I have no one to blame but myself, for I rarely practice." "I practice copiously, especially when I am at Pemberley, my brother's home. He recently had the most exquisite instrument sent up there for me. I can barely wait to play it." "It sounds as though your brother is very thoughtful." "Oh, he is indeed," the young lady exclaimed with some energy. "He is the best man I know." The Countess said, "Georgiana, perhaps Miss Bennet would like to see the pianoforte in the blue salon. Granted, it is not so grand as the one your brother gave you, but it is a fine instrument nonetheless." Now rather animated, Miss Darcy turned to Elizabeth. "Shall we proceed to the salon, Miss Bennet? I must have you play for me, for I suspect you are modest as regards your musical acumen." Elizabeth looked at Mrs. Hamilton. Seeing in the older woman's face tacit agreement with the scheme, she smiled heartily. "I accept your invitation with pleasure, Miss Darcy. And as for my modesty, it is incumbent upon me to say I have warned you." Chapter 3. Performing to Strangers. Darcy consulted his pocket watch for the third time in under a quarter hour. Being in a crowded ballroom surrounded by eager mammas in want of husbands for their single daughters was the last thing he wished for himself. Because he had rebuffed his cousin's request to go with him to such affairs too many times to count since his arrival in town for the season, Darcy supposed the only way to appease his cousin was to acquiesce. Not for the first time that evening, Colonel Fitzwilliam came from the dance to press his friend to join the festivities. "Darcy, had I known you would be such a dire old fellow this evening, I should not have insisted you attend the ball." His expression pinched, Darcy said. "Surely my repeated refusals provided some sort of clue as to how I would behave." "Well, now that you are here, I must have you dance. There are a plethora of young ladies in want of dance partners. It is a shame to see so many denied the privilege of your excellent companionship." Darcy raised an indignant brow. "Am I to give consequence to young women whom other men have slighted?" he scoffed. "I think not." "When you couch your position in such unflattering terms as that, I suppose not. But what say you to the prospect of making the acquaintance of some of the more recent additions among our society?" Darcy knew, without being told, to whom his cousin was referring, the flood of bright-eyed young ladies who had recently celebrated their coming-out balls and presentation at court. "I say no. Unlike you, I take no interest in performing to strangers. You had better return to the lovely Mrs. Connolly's side, for you are wasting your time with me." The Colonel glanced to the other side of the ballroom and smiled upon catching the eye of the woman of whom Darcy spoke. Adorned in an emerald-coloured silk gown which supplied a good view of her ample bosom, The dark-haired woman was indeed one of the handsomest creatures in the room. Widowed 2 years prior at the young age of 24, the freedom her tragic past afforded was commensurate with the vast fortune entailed. Ah, the lovely Mrs. Connolly indeed. Returning his attention to his cousin, the Colonel continued, "She's quite divine. She has a younger sister, you know. While she's not nearly so rich as our cousin Anne, your time spent with her will likely prove quite diverting, if you take my meaning." Darcy drew in a deep breath before folding his arms across his chest. He uttered not a single word in response to his cousin's insinuation. "Very well, old man. I shall leave you here standing about and looking rather stupid, I might add, amid the promise of such gaiety." With a nod of his head, the Colonel was gone directly. Having dressed with more than the usual care in preparation for the much-anticipated Richardson ball, Elizabeth gasped upon her arrival because of the splendour of it all. "My first ball of the season. I am a long way from Meryton. Pray, this evening's ball is everything a society ball ought to be." The bevy of introductions which immediately ensued afforded the chance to dance with a gentleman or two, but the vast disparity of the number of women in attendance, in comparison to gentlemen, was not inconsequential. As a result, Elizabeth was obliged to sit out more than a few dances. When she could, she made some excuse about needing to refresh herself before quitting the room. Though Elizabeth was Mrs. Hamilton's guest at the ball that evening, she did not intend to squander all her prospects for gaiety by lingering by the older woman's side. Unfortunately, the simpering antics of so many of the young ladies to whom she had been introduced that evening held no pleasure for Elizabeth either. Had I wanted to be surrounded by some of the silliest girls in all of England, I should have been quite satisfied to remain at home in Hertfordshire. My younger sisters, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, are quite proficient in that regard. Thoughts of her own sisters drew Elizabeth's mind to her time spent with Miss Darcy. What a pleasure it was to have tea again with the young woman and her aunt. Despite being Elizabeth's junior by nearly 5 years, Miss Darcy's sensibilities and ease in conversing on any number of subjects severely belied her youth. That is to say, once one manages to draw her out, Elizabeth considered. How unfortunate that Miss Darcy is not yet out in society, for I am sure this evening would be infinitely more pleasurable were she here. If Elizabeth could not spend the better part of the evening dancing, and as she did not wish to engage in meaningless chit-chat with silly girls, passing the evening pursuing one of her favourite pastimes would have to suffice, that being, studying the various people in the room. Walking about the room alone under the general guise of admiring the number of couples, and overall splendour such an evening of dancing and fine dining afforded, was infinitely more appealing to Elizabeth. She comported herself this way for the next half an hour. One person in particular caught her eye, a tall, handsome gentleman with dark, brooding eyes, and an air about him that set him apart from every other man in the room. She watched as he stalked about the place in a determined effort not to be ensnared by young ladies who may or may not have been acquaintances of his, but whose eagerness to be in his presence was embarrassingly evident. Elizabeth really did not know which situation amused her more, the young lady's ardent pursuits, or his clever means of eluding them. He was indeed an unusually handsome gentleman, and as she had nothing better to do, she indulged herself in admiring him from afar. Her pleasure in doing this lasted for some time until she lost sight of him among the crowd, soon after the officer with whom he had been speaking left his side. Perhaps the tall, handsome gentleman has absconded for the evening. What a shame, for I must now choose another creature to study. Pray, he or she is just as fascinating. Elizabeth turned to walk to another part of the room when, to her surprise, the object of her fascination stood not 2 steps away, directly in her path. The manner in which his dark eyes pored over her body from head to toe gave her pause. Her stomach fluttered amid the onslaught of his stare. Elizabeth swallowed, weighing how she ought to act in the face of such brazenness. Approaching a total stranger in such a circumstance meant breaking one of the strictest rules of proper decorum. But if I do not say something, I may very well forgo the possibility so many other young ladies in attendance this evening have evidently longed for. A disquieting thought crossed her mind. Perhaps the gentleman detected me studying him all evening, and he merely means to frighten me by behaving similarly toward me. If that indeed was the correct conjecture, Elizabeth knew exactly what she must do. My courage always rises with any attempt to intimidate me. Elizabeth took a deep breath. Courage. Please do not fail me now. Chapter 4. Perfectly safe. A step or two closer and they would be in each other's arms. The tall, handsome gentleman bowed ever so slightly. "Pardon me, miss." Elizabeth curtsied. "No, pardon me, sir." An awkward silence ensued. Standing this close, she found the stranger more handsome than she had thought. "Say something," she silently demanded. "Say anything." "I suppose you mean to chastise me for nearly colliding into you," she said, as a means of breaking the dreadful silence. "Or perhaps you feel I intentionally threw myself into your path, as have so many other young ladies before me this evening." His smile in the wake of her deliberate impertinence took Elizabeth aback. This is the first time I have seen him smile all night. "There is something about you which leads me to suspect that I am perfectly safe in that regard," he uttered finally. Elizabeth said, "Oh my!" I'm not sure whether I should be offended or flattered by such a remark. By his expression he was a bit baffled. "Pardon me?" "Should I be offended," she began, "because you perceive me as one who is not capable of tempting you, or flattered, because you are willing to risk that I am?" He nodded. "Risk it indeed. After all, the night is young." The gentleman cleared his throat. "That is to say, I dare not spend the entire evening eluding the company of young ladies who have, as you say, thrown themselves in my path." Though flattered in hearing this, Elizabeth did not mean to let him know. "I am surprised one would admit to such stratagems, sir," she responded, half rebukingly, half teasingly. "If what you are accusing me of is indeed engaging in a stratagem of some sort, it is evidently one I have not attempted to employ with you. No doubt I ought to consider myself among the luckier ladies in attendance this evening. Our conversing with each other as though we are acquaintances of a long duration must surely satisfy my purposes in preventing other young ladies from, again, as you say, throwing themselves in my path." Half shrugging, he continued, "However, before we continue engaging in such delightful subterfuge as this, I believe Subterfuge, sir. I don't know that I would consider myself a willing participant in your scheme to discourage the attention of other young women. I might argue you have given me no choice." "Well, I suppose you could walk away, but then I would be terribly hurt, and I do not believe you are the type of young lady who would willingly harm anyone." A challenge cloaked in flattery, Elizabeth silently considered. How intriguing! Before she could fashion a fitting response, the elegant Lady Ellen Fitzwilliam approached Elizabeth and her gentleman companion. "My dearest nephew, I see that you are acquainted with Miss Bennet." She looked at Elizabeth. "My dear, why did you not tell me that you already knew my nephew?" Elizabeth could feel the colour spread all over her body. "Your ladyship," she said, curtsying, "I am afraid—" The gentleman interrupted. "Your ladyship, I am afraid the young lady is far too generous to tell you that, until a few moments ago, the two of us had never laid eyes on each other. I took it upon myself to flaunt the rules of proper decorum by throwing myself into her path and introducing myself. However, I am failing miserably. If you would do the honours, I would appreciate it greatly." The Countess raised a quizzical brow. "By all means. Miss Elizabeth Bennet, allow me to present my nephew, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Darcy, as in Miss Georgiana Darcy. Do you know my sister?" "A little," said Elizabeth. "Well, what I mean to say is—" Here again Lady Ellen interrupted. "Indeed, your sister and Miss Bennet had the opportunity of making each other's acquaintance just the other day at my home." She smiled at Elizabeth fondly. "The two of them have since met on a few other occasions as well." She rather suspected, based on her conversations with his sister, that he was a very protective older brother. Elizabeth searched the gentleman's face for some sign of how her ladyship's revelation affected him. She detected no hint of disapproval, which she regarded as a good sign. On the other hand, she detected no trace of his tacit approval either. Lady Ellen's voice pierced her musings. "Darcy, more than a few of my friends have complained of your reluctance to dance this evening. I know how much you dislike the amusement in general, but I shall not accept that as an excuse, especially when there are so many young ladies in want of partners." She tucked her arm into the fold of Elizabeth's. "My dear Miss Elizabeth, I noticed you have not been dancing." She looked at her nephew. "Darcy, you must request Miss Elizabeth's hand for a set. I wager even you cannot refuse to dance when so much beauty is before you." As much as Elizabeth wanted to dance, doing so with a reluctant partner hardly seemed fun, She was on the verge of forming her mouth to say no to his aunt's entreaty, when the gentleman extended his hand most willingly. "I would consider it an honour, Miss Bennet." Elizabeth surrendered her dance card to his outstretched hand and watched as he pencilled in his name. Taking the card back, she glanced down and could not help but admire his excellent penmanship. She smiled a little inside. What else did I expect? His initial behaviour aside, he appears in every way the consummate gentleman. Elizabeth was once again by Mrs. Hamilton's side when Mr. Darcy claimed her hand for their dance. When at last the two of them stood opposite each other on the ballroom floor, a strange feeling came over Elizabeth in doing so. Is it just my imagination, or is every eye of the ton upon us? None of the previous dance couplings that evening had garnered such attention. It stood to reason that her estimable dance partner was the chief object of everyone's fascination. As a point of fact, I have yet to see the gentleman stand opposite anyone else this evening. Perhaps his dance skills are wanting. Her concern in that regard was put to rest the instant the orchestra commenced playing. Is there anything at all about Mr. Darcy that might be found wanting? As she was dancing with the older brother of her new friend, Miss Darcy, who quite frankly never had an unflattering thing to say about him, Elizabeth thought surely she would find their conversation throughout the dance engaging. She surely did not expect the now taciturn man opposite her. What on earth has become of the Mr. Darcy I met just a quarter-hour ago? Elizabeth silently beckoned. Dancing in silence was certainly not unheard of, but it was not exactly Elizabeth's idea of fun. She determined to draw him out when the dance reunited them. "I have always enjoyed this dance," she said, when they were once again face to face. "It is one of my favourites." "Indeed," he replied. She waited in vain for him to say more. At length she spoke on the size of the room, even the number of couples, and still he would not talk. Elizabeth grew more determined. "I now perfectly comprehend your motives for avoiding the dance floor all evening. I beg your pardon. At first, I suspected that your dance skills were wanting, and hence your reason for not dancing when there are so many young ladies in want of partners, but now I realise it is merely your way of avoiding conversation. I have never been given to understand that conversing while dancing was a rule, Miss Bennet." "Oh, but I sincerely believe one must have some conversation while dancing. I find it renders the experience infinitely more diverting." The two were parted again by the dance, and Elizabeth, pleased for having garnered more than a couple of syllables from the gentleman, could hardly wait until they were reunited. "Her ladyship said you know my sister Georgiana." "Indeed. We are recent acquaintances, of course. In the short time that I have known her, I must confess to having grown exceedingly fond of her." Mr. Darcy's expression in hearing this gave Elizabeth pause. "I hope that does not meet with your disapproval, sir." Without responding one way or another, Mr. Darcy said, "My aunt said nothing about your family. I presume they are long-time acquaintances of hers. Would that be on the Countess's side or the Earl's?" "Actually neither, Mr. Darcy." "Neither?" At the moment the dance drew the two of them apart. Elizabeth's busy mind would not be silenced. Pray, he is not the sort of gentleman who judges others by their particular situation in life. "I was introduced to Lady Matlock and by extension your sister by one of her ladyship's close friends, who just happens to be a close friend of one of my relations. Your aunt's friend is Mrs. Hamilton, the woman whom I was standing with when you claimed my hand for this dance. I presume you know her." "I have never had the pleasure of meeting her." "I am more than happy to introduce the two of you to each other after the dance." Again he did not respond to Elizabeth's offer. Instead he said, "Is that the extent of your family's connection to my uncle and my aunt, Lord and Lady Matlock?" "Indeed." His puzzled expression combined with his ensuing silence piqued Elizabeth's curiosity. "Sir, you appear troubled," she said. "It is just that Lord and Lady Matlock," he began, "are among the most prominent people in the ton. Their reach is wide and their connections are vast." Coming to an abrupt halt, Elizabeth drew a little closer and looked the gentleman straight in the eye. "My family is not considered as part of the ton, sir. My family hails from Hertfordshire in a village near Meryton." Now Mr. Darcy really was silent. The manner in which he looked at Elizabeth was such that no other man had ever looked at her before. Is he looking at me merely to find fault? Or perhaps there is another explanation, one I am unable to conceive. Whatever is his purpose, I dare not look away. Upon their resuming the dance, the sound of her pounding heartbeat shut out all the noise on the crowded ballroom floor. Her eyes staring into his brooding dark eyes, every other dancer blurred. The two of them were the only couple in the room, and so it was, at least in Elizabeth's busy mind, for the remainder of the dance. When the dance concluded, Mr. Darcy escorted Elizabeth back to Mrs. Hamilton's side. However, rather than remain long enough to allow for a proper introduction as Elizabeth had offered, he simply bowed and went away. Elizabeth almost gasped aloud. Almost! A kind, congenial woman, Mrs. Hamilton did not seem to be bothered in the least bit by Mr. Darcy's slight, but Elizabeth surely was, and she began to consider, Miss Darcy's high praise of her brother's excellent qualities aside, Mr. Darcy was not nearly so handsome after all. Chapter 5. Bewitching Creature. I have no one to blame but myself for my encounter with Miss Elizabeth Bennet this evening. Now it seems I cannot get her out of my head. Sitting alone in a dimly lit corner of White's, Darcy swallowed the remaining brandy in his glass and frowned as the amber liquid burned his throat. What was I thinking? The fact is, he never planned to have a face-to-face encounter with her at all, even though he had purposely walked to her side of the ballroom and taken up a spot not 2 feet behind her. His curiosity about the young woman who had spent so much of the evening indulging her unabashed curiosity about him demanded satisfaction. At length, Darcy espied a familiar figure approaching his table. It was his cousin, whom he had been expecting. No doubt the Colonel had observed the spectacle earlier that evening at the ball. "I was hoping to find you here," said Colonel Fitzwilliam. He took a seat in a comfortable leather chair across from Darcy, and then signalled a waiter, who wasted no time hurrying to the table. "I will have what my friend is having," the Colonel directed. "In fact, bring over the entire decanter, will you?" When the waiter went away, Colonel Fitzwilliam leaned back into his chair and looked at Darcy intently. "Pray, do not keep me in suspense." "In what regard?" Darcy asked. "As if you do not know," said the other man, his brow arched. "With so much to countenance, it would help if you were a bit more specific." "Very well," Colonel Fitzwilliam began. "Who was that bewitching creature who managed to tempt you onto the ballroom floor this evening? I believe I owe her my congratulations for succeeding where so many others had failed. Heaven knows that I had all but given up on you." Baffling is a more apt description. Indeed, Darcy had never been so baffled by any woman as he was by her. That, my friend, was Miss Elizabeth Bennet. By now the waiter had returned with a decanter of brandy and a single glass. After filling the glass for the Colonel, he refilled Darcy's upon receiving his silent consent. "Will you need anything else, sirs?" The Colonel waved the waiter off and, after taking a sip of his drink, returned his attention to the conversation at hand. "Elizabeth Bennet, you say? I was hoping you would introduce me to her, but you seem to disappear immediately after your set." Disappear, indeed. After spending the past half-hour in Miss Bennet's company, Darcy escaped the crowded ballroom, intending to clear his head in the cold night's air. Finding the chill insufficient to sort out what all had happened, he determined only a stiff drink or two at White's, beyond the temptation of members of the opposite persuasion, would do, and there he had remained ever since. "I'm amazed you have not made her acquaintance, for it appears that there are others in our family who are rather acquainted with the young woman." "Do you speak of anyone in particular? My brother Robert, perhaps?" the Colonel inquired, his brow arched. Darcy flinched. "Heaven forbid," he silently lamented. The Viscount Lord Robert Fitzwilliam was a determined rake. A strange feeling came over him, an odd mixture of concern and apathy. For all he knew, the young woman might very well be acquainted with Robert. He had not remained long enough after their set to think to ask, "Actually, it is your mother of whom I speak, your mother and my sister." "My mother and Georgiana?" Colonel Fitzwilliam asked, his tone evidencing his surprise in hearing this. "Yes," Darcy replied, nodding his head. "It would appear Miss Bennet met both of them at Matlock House very recently, unless I am mistaken." "Is that a hint of disapproval I detect in your voice?" "I must confess it caught me by surprise that someone so wholly unconnected to our family can openly boast of an acquaintance with Georgiana, however fleeting. Surely the young lady's having been a guest at Matlock House is a testament to her good character." "One would hope," Darcy muttered. "I trust her ladyship's judgment where my sister's welfare is concerned, else I would remove her from Matlock House. However, after the Ramsgate incident, I believe extreme caution is warranted to shield my sister from potential opportunists. Georgiana Darcy loved her brother very much. Owing to the difference in their ages by over a decade, she often looked up to him as one would a father. It was for that reason that she confided the entirety of her plan to elope with a man whose sole purpose in pursuing her had been her fortune of £30,000. The vile man had conspired with Mrs. Young, the woman in charge of Miss Darcy, to meet the young lady in Ramsgate and go about making love to her until she agreed to marry him. Georgiana was but 15 at the time, too innocent to distinguish between ardent love and mere infatuation, but sensible enough to realise that escaping to Gretna Green without her brother's knowledge would be the makings of not only a great scandal, but heartbreak for her entire family. Thank heavens I arrived at Ramsgate in time to put a stop to the sordid affair, despite the ensuing heartbreak to my sister in the aftermath of it all. Darcy smoothed his finger along the rim of his glass. My sister has always been rather shy. This incident at Ramsgate has been the means of shattering her trust in others. This knowledge gave him an even greater cause for concern as regarded Miss Bennet's sudden appearance in his sister's life. The Colonel began pouring himself another drink. It might help if we told my mother the entirety of what happened last summer, and then she would know precisely how to act where Georgiana's supervision is concerned. Darcy shook his head. Were her ladyship to learn what occurred in Ramsgate, she would be obliged to tell the Earl, who would then be compelled to tell Lady Catherine, for neither of them is entirely reconciled with our guardianship of my sister. Both of the noble Fitzwilliam siblings had argued vigorously among themselves that the guardianship of the niece of an earl ought not to be the responsibility of two unwed gentlemen, but there was nothing to be done but to accept the late Mr. Darcy's dictate. Staring at the amber liquid in his glass, he continued, It is one thing to allow Lady Catherine to constantly remind me of my duty to the family. I shall not give her fodder to dictate my sister's marital expectations as well. At least one of us ought to marry for love. He raised his glass to his lips and quickly swallowed the remaining contents. The burning in his throat aside, he said, No, the fewer people who know what happened in Ramsgate, the better for all concerned. Colonel Fitzwilliam leaned in. Lowering his voice, he said, There is always a possibility of Georgiana confiding the secret to another. I trust she will not, but if she does, I shall deal with the consequences. In the meantime, it is my responsibility to protect my sister from being taken in again. Do you believe Miss Bennet's intentions where Georgiana is concerned are dishonourable? Darcy shrugged a little. I do not know what to think. I know so little about the young lady. Having foolishly trusted Mrs. Young, I surely do not mean to make such a mistake again. So what do you plan to do about it? He eyed his cousin intently for a moment. In truth, he had not quite settled on how to handle the matter. All he knew was he had to do something, and quickly, in order to protect his sister. At length, Darcy spoke. As a start, I plan to launch an investigation into Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Her family, her past. She said her family lives in Hertfordshire, near the town of Meryton. The Colonel nodded. Pursing his lips, he said, You mentioned as a start. Have you another scheme in mind as well? The more Darcy thought about the young woman, the more fascinated he grew, fascinated and bewildered. He told his cousin as much. Concluding his speech, he said, Let me just say, there are some things I wish to learn about Miss Elizabeth Bennet which are best discovered on my own. Thank you for listening to Gravity Shades of Mr. Darcy chapters 1 through 5. If you have enjoyed this story thus far, and I hope you have, you will not want to miss what happens next. Subscribe to this channel today and be among the first to be notified when Gravity Shades of Mr. Darcy, the complete audiobook, is available for your listening pleasure. Your likes, subscribes, comments and shares help this channel grow.